You're still here. Good. I know a 3-day intermission is quite a long time, but I'm glad you are still around. Some rooms prefer witness, and while we were apart, the house has had a moment to settle. Pipes sighing softly, floorboards flexing with great familiarity, and those curious corners collecting their thoughts in the dim. Intermissions can be instructive. Silence rearranges things, memories, motives, and occasionally the very furniture of the mind itself, shifting subtly into shapes we do not immediately recognize. But the night is patient, and our catalog remains incomplete. So if your glass is refreshed, your chair reclined, and your curiosity suitably restored, let us resume our work. There are still stories waiting in the dark. The lighthouse stood too far inland, rising from a hill of granite made older than maps, older than names, older than any story that remembered the first rescue at sea. The stone beneath its foundation had endured centuries of wind and weather, yet the tower itself looked strangely against the ancient ground, as though it had been placed there long after the land had already decided what it was meant to be. Official records claim the lighthouse was commissioned in 1894, stone hauled by mule, bricks laid by weathered hands, brass mechanisms installed with careful precision. That is the version preserved in ledgers and municipal archives. But the locals will tell you something different. They will say the light was there long before the tower, long before the bricks, before the lens, long before any engineer arrived with blueprints and good intentions. On certain nights, they claim the hill itself once glowed beneath the trees, not bright, not blazing, but with a pale pulse that pressed softly through the fog. It was a dim, deliberate shimmer, as though something beneath the earth were remembering how to shine. When the lighthouse was finally built, it did not introduce the light, it confined it. Elias Rowan accepted the keeper's post the year after his wife passed away. Grief had hollowed the house that they once shared. In the quiet corridors, memory had grown louder than he could bear. The tower offered solitude instead of sympathy, routine instead of reminders. He preferred gears to grief and precision to pain. Each morning he wound the clocks, 3 in the tower, 2 in the small rooms below, and 1 worn pocket watch that he carried everywhere like a faithful companion. Their synchronized ticking filled the lighthouse with a careful cadence, a steady sequence of measured moments, tick, tick, tick. Harmony reassured him. Time behaved. Time obeyed. At exactly 11:11 each night, the lamp ignited. The beam began its slow ceremonial rotation, sweeping methodically across the dark forest beyond the tower. Across the treetops instead of tides, pine instead of prow, fog instead of foam. Visitors sometimes asked why the lighthouse stood so far from the water. Elias would simply reply, "Light travels farther than ships." What he did not say was this: some vessels do not sail on water. The first disturbance arrived quietly. During one nightly sweep, the beam hesitated. Not mechanically, not from friction or fatigue, but deliberately, as though something within the light itself had chosen to linger. Elias inspected the gears the following morning, oiling axles, measuring rotation, checking every brass tooth, and careful connection. The mechanism remained perfect, unwavering, obedient, exact. And yet, as autumn approached, the beam began lingering longer at the base of the tower each night, as though counting or waiting. On the first night of October, at precisely 11:17, 6 minutes beyond its usual schedule, the beam stopped entirely. It tilted downward towards the soil. Elias felt it before he heard anything. It was a low vibration humming through the tower floor, a subtle tremor that settled into his bones and rattled faintly in his teeth. It was not wind, it was not machinery, not thunder, it was recognition. He descended the spiral staircase with his lantern, its flame trembling as he stepped into the clearing below. The forest stood breathless around him. Even the insects seemed to withhold their chorus. And at the base of the tower, illuminated in a steady column of white light, he saw footprints. They formed a perfect circle around the structure, not approaching, not departing, but simply standing there. Each impression was faced forward, pressed deeply into the earth, as though unseen figures had waited there for a very long time. Elias began to count. The counting steadied him. It's 31, 32, 33. At the final print, he stopped. There was no tracks leading into the circle, no tracks leading away, only the ring itself. The beam narrowed, it brightened, it lowered, it found him. Elias removed his pocket watch and listened to its steady ticking for a moment, the small, stubborn sound echoing in the silent clearing. Then, with careful calm, he knelt and placed the watch upon the ground, and he stepped forward into the circle. Next evening, the lighthouse continued its rotation, perfectly aligned, perfectly unattended. Inside the tower, every clock still ticked its flawless harmony. At the base of the structure, however, the soil had shifted. 38 impressions now, not 37. 38. All facing inward. Still no tracks leading in, still none leading out. And every night since then, at exactly 11:11, the beam sweeps slowly across the forest, each rotation pausing just slightly, the place where the circle continues to grow. Some say lighthouses guide ships. Others say they watch the woods. But the oldest stories suggest something much simpler. They keep count. There once lived a gentleman named Percival Thorne, a man who dressed with a devotion to detail that bordered on reverence. His charcoal suits were pressed to a severity that never surrendered a crease. His polished Oxfords reflected the evening street lamps with quiet dignity, and at his wrists rested silver cufflinks shaped like crescent moons, always aligned, always symmetrical. He checked them often, not from vanity, but from reassurance. Symmetry steadied him. Order offered comfort. Precision provided peace. Percival preferred long walks at dusk, when the day was dissolving and the evening had not yet decided what shape it would take. It was a generous hour for shadows when they stretched and slipped and slowly separated from the discipline of daylight, wandering with a quiet willfulness along the pavement as though finally freed from form. At first, no one noticed anything usual about him. He tipped his hat to neighbors, he fed stray cats along the garden wall, and each morning he purchased the same newspaper from the same stall, folding it with delicate, deliberate care right beneath his arm. He was, in every visible way, a perfectly ordinary man. Except for one detail. His shadow did not always match him. Beneath lamplight, it sometimes shifted first, subtly settling into posture before he had chosen one. When he turned along quiet avenues, the silhouette behind him lingered with a fractional delay, as though reluctant to relinquish its position. Under certain lights, its outline thickened and deepened, darkening as if savory the illumination. When Percival raised his hand, the shadow's fingers occasionally stretched farther than a bone or a tendon would reasonably allow. Never dramatically, just enough to suggest a quiet, creeping appetite. On certain evenings, it leaned softly, selectively, toward passing silhouettes, as though listening, as though longing. Percival was not frightened. He was fascinated. Loneliness sharpens with subtle curiosities, and Percival Thorne had grown exquisitely, almost dangerously curious indeed. In time, he discovered, quite by accident, that shadows loosen easily at dusk, particularly from the lonely, the lingering, and the lost. The first came from a woman beneath a wavering gas lamp on Alder Street. Her wool coat hung loosely from her narrow shoulders, and a folded letter trembling faintly in her gloved hands. Across the street, warm window light revealed two carefully arranged place settings, though one chair was occupied. She hesitated before crossing, smoothing her hair, straightening her collar, silently rehearsing a conversation that might yet redeem the evening. And in that suspended second of uncertainty, her shadow lingered longer than she did. Percival just stepped beside it, not touching, not tugging, simply standing near. And when the gas lamp flickered, the shadow followed him home, adhering quietly to the wallpaper of his parlor, flat and flattering, cool and compliant. The second one came easier, and the third easier still, Soon Percival began collecting them during his twilight wanderings. A silhouette from a solitary bench, another from a tired traveler beneath a railway lantern, a thin, trembling trace from a man who lingered too long before a darkened shop window. He arranged them carefully along the walls of his parlor. Tall ones, bent ones, shivering ones, layer upon layer of silhouettes until the room itself seemed to darken with their presence. The walls grew matte and mute, lightless and laden, like ink applied too many times, until light no longer reflected there. It disappeared. At night, when the room changed, curtains stirred through the windows as though they were sealed. The air cooled without explanation. Breath sometimes ghosted faintly in the dimness, and the shadows shifted when Percival did not. One evening, as he paused beneath a lantern along the pavement, the small boy studying him from the curve spoke with quiet confusion. "Mister?" the boy asked, squinting thoughtfully. "Why are there so many behind you?" Percival smiled and replied politely and said, "There's only one." But when he turned, he saw them. Not flattened, not fixed, not obedient. They stretched behind him in a long, layered procession across the pavement, dozens of silhouettes standing in silent, symmetrical alignment, each one perfectly placed. And his own shadow no longer even touched his shoes. It stood among the others, facing him. Percival Thorne did not return home that evening. The house remained undisturbed, the parlor walls were bare once more, and the furniture arranged with its usual meticulous precision. Yet the following evening, as dusk settled across the quiet neighborhood, 41 shadows stretched across Percival's lawn, all of them angled toward the house, all of them waiting with a stillness that felt strangely deliberate and disturbingly determined. If tonight your shadow lingers a half a breath longer than you do, if it leans where you do not, if it waits with a patience you do not remember granting, do not look down too quickly. It may already be standing somewhere else. Ashburn Hall was once considered the quiet jewel of the countryside, a manor of staggering beauty whose stone facades were softened by ivy and whose tall, luminous windows spilled candlelight into the evening gardens scented with cut roses and damp earth. Invitations to Ashburn were coveted things. Scholars arrived with nervous anticipation. Artists traveled from distant cities in hopeful pursuit of recognition, and nobility attended for the simple, shimmering prestige of being seen there. Composers and philosophers lingered long after midnight, convinced that some rare and restless brilliance hovered beneath the vaulted ceilings. And to dine beneath the chandeliers of Ashburn Hall was to be noticed, or, more importantly, to be remembered. Now, the master of this house was known simply as the Archivist. No surname was ever attached to him, no lineage listed, no history held in any official account. When guests inquired politely about his past, he would smile with gentle, disarming amusement and redirect the conversation with such effortless elegance that the question itself felt improper to pursue. He favored velvet cummerbunds of midnight black and tailored coats that felt flawless and faultless in precision along his shoulder lines. His gloves were immaculate and always worn, even at the dinner table. His voice was measured, his manners meticulous, his smile deliberate, calm, controlled, and carefully composed with a kind of practiced perfection. And though seasons slipped and decades drifted quietly past, his appearance did not seem to change. No, Ashburn Hall was particularly famed for its gallery, where long corridors stretched along the length of the manor and walls were lined from floor to ceiling with towering portraits set inside ornate, opulent, gilded frames. The oil paint was so rich, so radiant, so remarkably luminous that the figures seemed less painted and more paused. Not posed, but suspended in the delicate, decisive instant before something was spoken. A duchess captured mid-laughter, a poet with lips parted just before speech, a diplomat held in the fragile moment between confession and composure. Every face was preserved at the precarious threshold of something unsaid. The Archivist was a gracious host. He listened more than he spoke, and when he asked questions, he did so gently, almost lazily, and yet with a precision that pressed and probed beneath the surface of even the most practiced conversationalist. He seemed to savor the answers themselves, but the fragile, fleeting moment just before they were spoken, the pause before the phrase, the silence before the statement. There was once a young painter who attended Ashbourne as a guest, a man talented, ambitious, and fiercely devoted to the aim of immortality through art. During supper, he spoke passionately about preserving beauty against decay, about trapping brilliance before it dimmed, about capturing the soul before time could tarnish it. The Archivist listened with quiet attention, his head tilting slightly as candlelight settled softly in his eyes, and while the painter continued along in the evening, intoxicated by his own ideas and enamored with his own imagined eternity. By morning, there was a new portrait that hung in the western corridor. The young painter stood, captured mid-stroke, brush lifted toward a canvas that was no longer present. His expression was alive with fervent inspiration, as though the next moment of his hand would produce something magnificent. His unfinished work was nowhere to be found. Years later, a young violinist performed in the gallery. Her music unfurled through the hall like silk, slipping through careful fingers, somehow sorrowful and softly sustained, an adagio that grew conversation into silence and held the room in breathless, balanced stillness beneath its chandeliers. When the piece ended, her bow remained suspended, the violin poised against her shoulders, the string beneath it still whispering faintly with a sound too soft for most ears to hear. Applause followed, polite, slow, measured, muted, but the musician did not lower her arm. The Archivist approached her slowly, circling her still figure with quiet consideration, studying her profile as though examining a composition almost complete and already chosen. By morning, the new portrait adorned an eastern corridor. The violinist preserved in flawless stillness, bow raised, posture poised, eyes bright, unspent music. The frame itself was still carrying the faintest scent of fresh oil and varnish. Over the years, the collection grew. Not subtly, not suddenly, but not dramatically. It was steadily, silently, with a kind of persistent purpose. Each subject preserved at the height of revelation, at the precise moment before change and decay and regret or disappointment could arrive. Visitors often remarked on how uncannily lifelike the portraits appeared. Fabric held with the weight of real cloth, skin carried with the quiet glow of living flesh, and the eyes reflected candlelight with unsettling, almost understanding clarity. Depending on the angle, expressions seemed to shift, not enough to confirm, just enough to disturb. And there were evenings when the archivist walked the gallery alone, long after the guests had retired, gloved hands folded beneath his back, as his gaze moved slowly, deliberately from face to face. During these quiet circuits, the air grew heavy. Candles dimmed without explanation, and afterward he always appeared restored. Color returned subtly to his cheeks, his posture straightened, his gaze sharpened, and the faint silver threads that once touched his temples quietly vanished again, as though time itself had reconsidered its claim upon him. In later years, travelers began noticing something peculiar. Ashbourne Hall no longer appeared on regional maps. Roads that once led directly towards the estate now curved carefully away. Survey records offered only vague references, and those who attempted to return, and often themselves, were found at unfamiliar crossroads and places they did not remember passing before. Even those who had attended struggled. When pressed to describe exactly where it had been, they could recall the chandeliers in the gallery and the velvet voice of the host, but the road itself seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. And so there once stood, in a stretch of countryside most modern maps no longer acknowledge, a matter known as Ashbourne Hall. Its windows tall, its corridors lined with gilded frames, its gallery eager and waiting. Somewhere along those silent walls, an empty space remains, reserved. Every gallery has a curator, and every collection has a purpose. But some collections are permanent. There once was a man who developed the habit of speaking aloud whenever he believed himself to be alone. Not loudly, and certainly not for performance, but in a low, measured murmur that prevented the silence from growing too comfortable and too confident, too inclined to settle. Silence, he had discovered, becomes assertive if left unattended. His room was kept in careful, calculated order. Lamps were angled with imprecise intention, so that their light fell exactly where it was meant to and nowhere else. Shelves remained aligned with quiet mathematical patience, and a mirror hung beside a narrow closet door where the hinge was so oiled so thoughtfully that it opened without a whisper or a complaint. He preferred his surroundings cooperative. Each evening he followed the same ritual, taking the same chair, smoothing the cuffs of his wrists with quiet care, clearing his throat with polite deliberation, and beginning to speak. Stories, usually observations gathered from distant places, accounts of interruptions and peculiarities, small narrations about preservation and pause, about hesitation and holding, about moments that lingered longer than they should. His tortoise-shell cat often lay perched along the back of his chair like a curious inspector, watching the room behind him while he spoke, her tail flicking softly through the still air, and her ears angling towards the closet door as though responding to something subtle, something slight, something just beyond the reach of human hearing. He never turned when she did. At first, the room behaved properly. The air remained still, the walls held their shape with quiet discipline, and the mirror reflected exactly what it was asked to reflect, and the closet door remained closed and unmoving, a well-behaved room by every observable measure. But on occasions, when he paused mid-sentence, something interesting began to happen. Silence did not settle, it hovered, attentive, aware, almost anticipatory. On certain nights, the air cooled faintly along the back of his neck, not sharply, not subtly, but just enough to instinct kick in and suggest that the room had shifted in its attention. He would continue speaking without haste, his tone steady and deliberate, as though addressing an unseen audience that required patience more than explanation, while occasionally a thin beam of distant light would pass across the window, rotating, sweeping slowly through the darkness beyond the grass, never entering, only lingering a fraction of a second longer than necessary before slipping away again. Kat did not seem to care for that. Her body would stiffen along the back of the chair, claws pressing softly into the fabric, her eyes following the movement outside with a fixed and focused intensity. And he would reach back, then, resting a calm, careful hand against her fur, quiet reassurance for both of them. As the evenings passed, he began to sense something more deliberate within the room itself. When he reached for his glass, the mirror seemed eager to assist. When he shifted his posture, shadows along the wall adjusted with quiet anticipation, not copying, but preparing. It was then that he realized something unsettling. The room was not echoing his words. It was arranging them, cataloging them, filing them carefully into some unseen, spoken system of war. I'm going to tell you that sentence again because I read it incorrectly. It was then that he realized something unsettling. The room was not echoing his work. It was arranging it, cataloging it, filing it carefully into some unseen, unspoken system of order. The man altered nothing in his routine. Consistency is calming, and Predictability discourages inspection. And yet the pressure within the room continued to grow, but loud, not violent, but present, like someone leading forward in the darkness, waiting patiently for a particular phrase to appear. So he began crafting his cadence more carefully, allowing some thoughts to remain unfinished and certain sentences to soften and dissolve before the conclusions could arrive. The room seemed to approve. The air softened and the mirror steadied and the closet remained quiet. But there were nights when the silence did not lean politely. It pressed with a presence that felt calm and collected rather than sudden or severe. The cat would rise slowly, then her gaze fixated something beyond him, something that hovered just beyond the reach of reflection. He never turned because turning acknowledges and acknowledgement invites. Instead, he continued speaking of collections and careful curations of rooms that preserve and presumptively prepare, of moments interrupted before they can complete themselves, of rehearsals of some mistake for stories. And gradually, with quiet, calculated patience, the man began to understand something important. The accounts he shared were warnings meant for himself. They were instructions, not for the room, but for those listening somewhere else. Because if enough people begin to recognize a pattern, the pattern weakens. If enough eyes remain open, certain things hesitate. The beam of light still passes by the windows occasionally. The cat still stiffens under the movements unseen, and the mirror still reflects. Mostly. The man in the chair continues his ritual each evening, smoothing his cuffs, adjusting the lamp, choosing his words with deliberate, disciplined care, careful not to speak too plainly, careful not to fall silent. Silence is an invitation, and the man in the chair never turned around. Not once. Not yet. Stories are curious things, because sometimes we are not the only ones listening. We have covered considerable ground this evening. Reflections that refuse to behave, warnings that wandered ashore, memories that traveled farther than reason should responsibly allow, and of course, rooms that preserve more than they politely permit. If you find yourself thinking about these accounts tomorrow, do not rush to resolve them. Stories prefer patience. They reveal their true shape slowly and subtly, and sometimes long after the lights have returned and the room has resumed its quiet, convincing normalcy. And should you choose to revisit the closet, you will find the door open. The lamp is lit, and this chair is waiting exactly where you left it, steady and silent and prepared. And if you suspect someone else might benefit from keeping the room occupied, you already know what to do. For those of you joining me for the first time tonight, welcome. You are now keepers. Until our next gathering, remain attentive, not anxious. Attentive. I appreciate you joining me tonight. My name is not important. You may refer to me as the host, and I just might be the monster in your closet.